Briefly about the speaker, Dr. Shankar Rajaraman is a psychiatrist by training, a researcher by profession, and a Sanskrit poet by passion, in his own words. After completing his MBBS from the MS Ramaya Medical College and a postgraduate degree in psychiatry from JJMMC Davangere, he went on to do an MA in Sanskrit, in which he scored the first rank and a gold medal, followed by an MSc and PhD in psychology. His PhD topic is titled A Qualitative Approach to the Psychology of Three Self-Conscious Emotions from Sanskrit Poetics. He has translated two Ayurvedic texts, Kshema Kutuhalam and Bhojana Kutuhalam, and two Sanskrit poems, Kokila Sandesha and Madhura Vijaya, into English. He has also translated the Annapana Upabhoga section from Someshwara's Manasollasa into Kannada and the Vachanas of Basaveshwara as well as Kanakadasa's Nalacharitre from Kannada to Sanskrit. He is a recipient of the Badarayana Vyasa Sammana from the President of India and the Hiriyanna Award from the Karnataka Sanskrit University, as well as the Vagdevi Prashasti for his contribution to Sanskrit literature. Dr. Shankar Rajaraman is one of the most well-known Sanskrit poets and an extremely diverse and nuanced researcher, and it gives me enormous pleasure to welcome Dr. Shankar.
Dr. Pusha?
Yeah, am I audible?
Yeah, okay.
Thank you, Pushya, for Dr. Pushya, for the introduction. This is a PPT presentation that I am making, and I request Ashwini or Pushya to share the screen. It's titled Self and Experience in Sanskrit Poetics, and coming to the first slide. So we'll enter into the topic without much ado. Indian aesthetics or Sanskrit aesthetics in specific is called as Alankara Shastra, and are you able to hear me?
Yes, sir, we are able to hear you.
Yeah, thank you. So Sanskrit aesthetics is specifically called as Alankara Shastra or Sahitya Shastra. It is you call it as the scientific study of literature. And aestheticians have discussed mainly two purposes of literature. One of them is entertainment, which goes by the name of Preeti, and education, which goes by the name of Vyutpatti. And these are the terms that Abhinav himself uses, Preeti and Vyutpatti. And how are these purposes realized? They are realized through the communication of experience. So you get entertained as well as educated by a communication of experience. And when you say experience, the experience of what and experience of whom are natural questions that arise. So it is the experience of certain mental states, communicating the experience of certain mental states, and these are the mental states of characters, and these are communicated, for example, in Bharata through actors and later through poets. So coming to the next slide. Yeah, can we move on to the next slide, please? Yeah. There are certain aestheticians whom I shall discuss, beginning with Bharata, whom many of you know is the author of Natya Shastra, a big compendium of dramaturgy, one of the first such works in the history of world literature itself. And Bharata is supposed to have lived somewhere between the 2nd century BC and 2nd century AD. Bharata knows that there is something that differentiates aesthetic experience from mundane experience, or else we wouldn't be actually watching a play or reading a work of literature if it hadn't given us an experience which is different from mundane experience, because we could always take resort to mundane experience in order to get aesthetic experience. So Bharata obviously knows that there is something different in aesthetic experience, and that makes it unique from mundane experience. But he chooses not to actually dwell on it, and his concerns as a dramaturgist are basically practical. So these are the 4 questions that he tackles. He first of all wants to provide a list of states. You could call them mental states, subjective states, or experiential states, which are communicated by actors. And this, by no stretch of imagination, is a very easy task to make a list of all possible non-overlapping mental states which are communicated by actors. The second task that was in front of Bharata was to classify these states into 2 groups based on a particular difference, which I shall be explaining in the coming slides. And he classified them into 2 groups, the enduring and the transient, the sthai bhavas and the vyabhichari bhavas. And the third task was to explicate a hierarchical relationship between them. He wanted to explicate a relationship, and finally it turned out to be a hierarchical relationship, because the transient mental states occur within the umbrella of enduring mental states. So there are several transient mental states occur within the context of an enduring mental state. And so there is a hierarchical relationship between these 2 groups of mental states that Bharata proposed. And finally, he also had to discuss how these mental states can be communicated by the actors to the audience. Given that these mental states are all experienced firsthand, there should be a means by which actors can actually communicate these subjective mental states to the spectator. And Bharata dwelt upon this also. So coming to the next slide. So what did Bharata do? He came up with a list of 49 mental states, and he classified them into 2 groups. One group of 8 mental states, which he called as sthai bhavas, or the enduring mental states, or the stable mental states, and the remaining 41, which he called as vyabhichari bhavas, or transient mental states. And in any one play, one of these 8 sthai bhavas is communicated more frequently than all the other 48 mental states. So there is one sthai bhava to which all other mental states become like vyabhichari bhavas. And the often quoted example is one of waves arising from ocean and disappearing to it. So if the ocean were to be like a sthai bhava, these waves can be considered as vyabhichari bhavas. And all these vyabhichari bhavas finally rise from the sthai bhava and end up in this sthai bhava only to nurture it. And coming to the next. So this is a schematic representation of the relationship between sthai bhavas and vyabhichari bhavas. You have an overarching sthai bhava, which I have called as mental state 1, under which several mental states come, mental state 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, etc. But mental state 2 itself is not just a vyabhichari bhava under mental state 1, but it is also a sthai bhava under which MS3, MS4, MS5, and MS6 come as vyabhichari bhavas. So you can see how this relationship is very relative. So whereas mental state 1 is sthai bhava for all the other mental states, mental state 2 is a vyabhichari bhava under mental state 1, but is a sthai bhava in relationship to mental state 3, 4, 5, and 6. On the other hand, mental state 3, 4, 5, and 6 are all vyabhichari bhavas. These come and go and do not prolong for a greater part of the literary work. So to come to the next slide. Yeah, this is another example, and Bharata himself quotes an example from cooking. So if you were to consider a dish such as pongal and list out its ingredients, obviously you will start by listing with rice, and then go on to moong dal, water, and ghee, pepper, jeera, ginger, etc. Nobody will start the list with, say, ghee, pepper, and jeera. They will all start with rice, because rice is the overwhelming ingredient that is present in pongal. And in the same way, the sthai bhava is the overwhelming mental state that is communicated through a piece of work. And all other mental states only go on to increase or go on to nurture this sthai bhava, just as the taste of moong dal, water, moong dal, ghee, pepper, jeera, etc. only go on to enrich the taste of rice. In the same way, the vyabhichari bhavas only enrich the taste of the sthai bhava. Coming to the next slide. Can we? Yeah. So if we take the example of a movie, of movies, Thai Bhava can be considered as the take-home message of a particular movie. So what is the mental state that is that you take home when you after you have watched a movie? So in these three examples, the first obviously will the mental state that you would go home after watching the movie will be love, and in the second it would be horror. In the third it would be what we call as utsaha, which is also one of these Thai bhavas. So Thai bhavas of the rasa called as Veera. So coming to the next slide. Yeah. So this was another of the Bharata's exercise. It was to provide a comprehensive list of which Vyabichari bhava. So we know that Vyabichari bhavas come under Thai bhavas, and you have these 41 Vyabichari bhavas and 8 Thai bhavas. So Bharata's next exercise was to provide a list of which Vyabichari bhava can come into the context of which Thai bhava. That is, which mental states can bring which other mental states within its context. And to give an example, Bharata says that love can bring within its context several other mental states, except disgust, rage, and lassitude. Lassitude goes by the name of alasya. Rage, rage is ugrata, and disgust is jugupsa. So love can bring all other mental states except disgust, rage, and lassitude. Anger, on the other hand, can bring mental states like pride, envy, rage, fickleness of mind called as chapalya, agitation, erroneous knowledge, or moha. And these various mental states can come under the context of anger. So coming to the next slide. The most difficult question which Bharata faced was to discuss how one can communicate these mental states. Given that these mental states are experienced firsthand, there must be a way to communicate these mental states. And Bharata, according to Bharata, there must at least be two pieces of information for a mental state to be communicated by the actor to the spectator. And what are these? The antecedent stimulus and the consequent response. So it is through these antecedent stimuli and consequent responses that mental states are inferred. They are communicated through inference. Whereas a mental state is subjective, the vibhava and the anubhava, that is the stimuli and the responses, are not subjective, but they are objective. And it is through these objective correlates that something subjective like a mental state can be communicated. To give an example, say your friend is going through sorrow, and obviously you cannot get into his mind to experience sorrow firsthand. But there are two pieces of information from which you infer that your friend is going through sorrow. So a stimulus and a response. If you know that your friend has lost his close relative recently, and you see your friend shedding tears, then through these two pieces of information, the vibhava and the anubhava, you can make an inference of the bhava. So the vibhava is the death of friend's close relative, that is the stimuli. The anubhava is the shedding of tears by the friend. And through these two correlates, you make an inference that your friend is going through the mental state of sorrow. Coming to the next slide. In fact, Sanskrit aestheticians are also don't agree mutually on whether it is through inference that this happens. But to keep the discussion simpler, I brought in this aspect of inference. So the Sanskrit aestheticians argue that inference also happens in everyday life, but in such everyday life inference doesn't give rise to the sort of joy that we experience when we are watching the play. So how could inference be working? So we'll not go into those polemics, but just to make the presentation simpler, I brought in this point. To give an example, Bharata gives a long list of stimuli and responses for each of the 49 mental states that he lists. And the list of the stimuli and responses is non-exhaustive. He doesn't say these are the only stimuli and these are the only responses through which a mental state can be inferred. Because the list, if the list newer stimuli and newer responses are keep on getting added to the list with time. So there could be a way, there could have been a way by which say shame was communicated in in Bharata's time, but that might not hold good as a response for the contemporary times. Therefore, Bharata is very intelligent in keeping the list non-exhaustive, and he knows that through time, lot of other stimuli and responses can get added. To give an example, an exercise which Bharata would have done would be, say, asking what causes pride and how is pride expressed. And so for this, he provides answer. So for all the 48 mental states, he asks these questions. How is a particular mental state caused and how is it expressed? So coming to the next slide. For example, pride, he gives the following stimuli: authority, lineage, physical beauty, youthfulness, scholarship, physical prowess, wealth, being respected by superiors, praise for one's qualities, superhuman power, acquiring a desired object, etc. And for responses, displaying the disrespect, confrontation, not answering, mocking, transgressing superiors, mannerisms of the eyes and eyebrows, boastfulness, looking at others with the neck raised, shamelessness, taunting, laughter, etc. And as you know, he always ends saying Adi or etc. in order to keep the list as open-ended as possible. Coming to the next slide. So we looked at the concern of Bharata, and it was a very practical concern that Bharata had. But the concerns of other aestheticians are quite different. So most of them are concerned with discussing about the nature of aesthetic experience itself, and how worldly objects and everyday subjects are transformed during an aesthetic experience. So some of the aestheticians that I shall be discussing in the slides that follow are Bhattanayaka, Abhinavagupta, Bhoja, and Rupa Goswami. So coming to the next slide, let us first look at Bhattanayaka. So Bhattanayaka, he discusses 3 stages in the process of aesthetic reception. And the first stage is a very literal stage. So you get the literal meaning of what is going on the stage. But as we are getting into the process of knowing the literal meaning, and as the literal meaning becomes clear, we go into a second stage. It's a very big leap from the first stage to the second stage. And in the second stage, what happens is a process called as Sadharanikaranam comes into play. And this can be translated as generalization or impersonalization. What happens in Sadharanikaranam is that the vibhava, the anubhava, as well as the bhava become generalized. Whereas in the first stage, it is about Rama's sorrow because he has lost Sita, and Rama is shedding the tears. In the second stage of Sadharanikaranam, it is not about Rama's sorrow per se. It is about the sorrow of any person who has lost somebody whom he loves. And the tears are not the tears of just Rama. These tears transcend the barrier of time, place, and person. These are tears for all times to come. So, because there is a generalization of the vibhavas and the generalization of the anubhava, the generalization of the stimuli as well as the generalization of the response, the mental state also gets generalized. The mental state that comes in between, or the mental state that is communicated through the vibhavas and the anubhavas, also gets generalized. But where is this generalized mental state located? Because this generalized mental state does not belong to any time, any place, or any person, obviously we would say that it is not located anywhere. And Bhattanayaka doesn't mention where these generalized mental states are located. And it is obviously not in one spectator, because if these general mental states were to be located in one spectator, it would then be particular and not be generalized. When the spectator is actually exposed to these generalized mental states, and we don't know where these generalized mental states are, but the spectator does get exposed to these generalized mental states, there is some change that occurs in the spectator's mind also. And this change mirrors the mental state to which he is exposed. And what is the change that occurs? There is what is called as a settling of rajas and tamas. These are gunas. You must have heard of the 3 gunas which are discussed in the Sankhya: the sattva guna, the rajo guna, and the tamo guna. If the rajo guna and tamo guna are considered as dirt, and sattva guna is considered as something clear, what happens in the second stage is the settling of rajas and tamas and the surfacing of this clear sattva. And when there is the surfacing of the clear sattva in the mind of the spectator, the mind now becomes like a polished mirror. And in this polished mirror, the self of the spectator is clearly reflected. And in Bhattanayaka actually confirms to the Mimamsa Shastra, and in that Shastra, the self can be considered as of the nature of bliss. And so the self is now reflected in the polished mirror of the spectator's mind. And once it is reflected, the self actually perceives its own clear reflection in the mind. And this perception is also joyful because what is reflected is the joyful self. And Bhattanayaka says that this joy, he calls it as Brahmananda Sahodara, the younger brother, younger sibling of the happiness of the joy of a yogi. The joy of a yogi is Brahmananda, and the joy of the spectator is not Brahmananda, but he says that he calls it as just a step below Brahmananda, and therefore he calls it as Brahmananda Sahodara, and he does not call it as Brahmananda because in this experience, in this aesthetic experience, there is still the binary of the self and its image. So the self is looking at its image, and that act of looking, perceiving its image is joyful, but still there is this binary of the self and the image, and therefore this is not Brahmananda, where the self would be nestled in itself and not be looking at its image. And here it is looking at its image. Therefore, it is not Brahmananda, but it is Brahmananda Sahodara. Let us go to the next slide. This is just a schematic representation of Bhattanayaka's theory. So Bhattanayaka basically discusses three different stages: the stage of Abhida, the stage of Bhavakatva, and the stage of Bhojakatva. The first stage is one of Abhida, where you get the literal meaning of what is going on the stage. In the second stage is what is called as Bhavakatva, where there is generalization of not just the Vibhavas and the Anubhavas, but also the mental state that is communicated through these Vibhavas and Anubhavas. And in the third stage of Bhojakatva, you have the surfacing up of Sattva and the settling down of Rajas and Tamas. And because of this surfacing of Sattva, there is an experience of joy. I'll not go into the other details of how various mental states, what is the change that mirrors exposure to different mental states. That is beyond the purview of the present talk. Going to the next slide. Let us come to Abhinavgupta. So Abhinavgupta borrows Bhattanayaka's concept of Sadharanikarana. However, unlike Nayaka, who doesn't localize, so we saw how Nayaka doesn't localize these generalized mental states anywhere, and he doesn't localize it in the spectator's mind also. On the other hand, Abhinavgupta says that the mental state is actually present in the spectator's mind. Because of the same reason that Nayaka gives. Nayaka says that it cannot be present everywhere because it is generalized. But Abhinavgupta says that for the very reason that it is generalized, it is present in every person who is watching a performance and or reading a particular piece of literature. So the generalized mental state is not lying somewhere in mid-air, but it is present in the mind of the person who is watching the performance or reading a piece of literature. So, and according to Abhinavgupta, this mental state, this generalized mental state, is directly illuminated by the blissful light of consciousness. In his, from his philosophical background, this consciousness would go by the name of Shiva or something, and it is by nature blissful, and it illuminates everything. So it also illuminates this mental state. And because the light of Shiva or light of Sambit is itself blissful, the generalized mental state is also experienced as blissful. So this is just a schematic representation of what I just discussed. So once there is this Sadharini Kritarati, that is the generalized love, this generalized love is illuminated by the light of consciousness. And because consciousness itself is joyful, this mental state, which is illuminated by the light of consciousness, is also experienced as joy. Coming to the next slide. So let us look at 4 different scenarios. One from everyday life, one the text, one when somebody is reading a text, and finally the spectator's mind. So in everyday life, say there is a person called A, and A is separated from his wife, and A sheds tears, and A's experience of shoka is very personal. In the text, A is transformed into somebody. A is transformed to somebody called as Rama, a character called as Rama. and Rama is now separated from Sita, and there are these tears which specifically belong to Rama. But when somebody is reading the text, it is no longer Rama now. You transcend the barrier of time, place, and person that Rama lived in, or the personhood of Rama, and you go on to the next stage of Sadharanikarana. Here you have not only Rama's shoka, but generalized shoka, generalized sorrow, which results from the general category of separation from beloved. And the tears are no longer a particular person's tears, be it A's tears or Rama's tears. These are generalized tears. And within this generalized shoka, you also have the audience shoka being included. So the audience, if A were to be an audience, his generalized shoka is also part of this generalized shoka of every person who is watching the performance. So his shoka is shared by the shoka of all the spectators as well as the shoka of Rama. So coming to the next slide. Bharata discusses, Abhinavgupta discusses the difference between mundane and aesthetic experiences. And he says that there is this repose of consciousness, that is samvid vishranti. Samvid is consciousness and vishranti is repose. And this repose of consciousness occurs only in aesthetic experience. And what do you mean by repose of consciousness? What he means is there is no other thought that occurs in the consciousness during aesthetic experience. On the other hand, mundane experience is different from aesthetic experience because there is no repose of consciousness in mundane experience. There is always the advent of an additional thought during mundane experience. For example, the thought could be, this experience must continue, or this experience must end, etc. And Abhinavgupta discusses this especially under the heading of obstacles to aesthetic experience, rasa vignas. So he discusses 8 rasa vignas, and one of them, the first one, in fact, is what he discusses as will be delineated below. So next slide. So how a second thought actually disturbs rasa experience is what he is discussing, and therefore the arousal of the second thought is like a vigna, is like a hurdle to the experience of rasa. So when one is experiencing one's own pleasure or sorrow, there is always an emergence of a second thought in the consciousness. And how could these? Why could this second thought arise? Because the person who is experiencing fears that the experience might end, or he or she desires to safeguard the experience so that the experience continues, or he or she might desire to search for another similar experience, or desire to get rid of the experience, or desire to make the experience public, or desire to hide the experience. So these are secondary thoughts that occur. And according to Abhinavgupta, this is the greatest obstacle to the unfolding of aesthetic experience, the advent of a secondary thought. Even when we are actually vicariously experiencing another person's experience of pleasure or sorrow, Abhinavgupta says that a second experience of our own pleasure, sorrow, or stupefaction, that is moha, or neutrality, interrupts that experience. So, for example, we could have thoughts such as, he is my friend, he is my foe, or he is somebody whom I am unconcerned about. These secondary thoughts actually prevent the experience of rasa in everyday life. On the other hand, such secondary thoughts don't occur when we are having aesthetic experience, and therefore there's the vishranti, the settling down of consciousness. Coming to the next slide. Can we go to the next slide, please? Yeah. So a connoisseur, a hridaya, is free of such including thoughts. Therefore, he is called as Vimala Hridaya, one of a clear heart. He or she is also not at the mercy of his or her own experience of pleasure, which stems from the object of desire or stems from the object of hate. So these secondary thoughts are not present in aesthetic experience, and therefore aesthetic experience involves the settling of consciousness and thereby the experience of joy. Coming to the next slide. Can we go to the next slide, please? Yeah. another difference between spiritual, he also discusses the difference between aesthetic and spiritual experience. So aesthetic experience is not enduring. So it is present only as long as we are engaging with the work of art. Say, as long as we are present in the playhouse, or as long as we are reading a work of literature, this experience is aesthetic experience is present. It lasts only as long as one is engaged watching a play or reading a literary work. On the other hand, a spiritual experience cannot be considered as something which is fleeting. A spiritual experience is always enduring. And yogic experience is characterized by tatasya, neutrality, as well as sakala vaishayikoparaga shunyata, or askuta vishayavesha vaivashya, which is the fading of the material world. But there is no such fading of the material world in the aesthetic experience. The fading of the askutata, that is the fading of what is shown in front of us, is actually an obstacle in the case of aesthetic experience. If we are watching a play and what we are watching is not clearly visible to us, it will actually become an obstacle in that experience of a play. On the other hand, the material world actually fades in the yogic experience, and therefore what holds good in the case of a yogic experience is actually an obstacle in the case of an aesthetic experience. Coming to the next slide. So how can we differentiate the mundane, the aesthetic, and the spiritual experiences? So these are three different sorts of experience. So to be in the mundane, aesthetic, and spiritual planes is to have three different sorts of experiences. Mundane experience, according to Abhinav Gupta, is sukha or dukkha pradana. That is dominated by sukha or dominated by dukkha. He doesn't call them as solely sukha and solely dukkha. He does not call mundane experience as solely pleasurable or solely displeasurable, because every pleasurable experience has a seed of displeasure in it, according to him, and every displeasurable experience has a seed of pleasure in it. For example, when we are happy because of being united with somebody whom we love, there is always this underlying fear of losing that object which we love. In the same way, when we are in any difficult experience, we always have this hope of being freed of that experience. So there is still because of this hope, there is still an aspect of sukha in in an experience that is characterized by displeasure. Aesthetic experience is joyous, and it is joyous even when the mental state that is communicated by the character is negative. So even if the character communicates a mental state such as shoka, that is sorrow, it is experienced as joyous, and it goes by the name of rasa or rasananda. Spiritual experience is described variously in different philosophical systems. Sometimes it is described as of the nature positively in terms such as Brahmananda. It is very joyous. On the other hand, sometimes some philosophies may describe it as in a negative fashion. For example, as complete and eternal cessation of sorrow. There is nothing positive in the experience of moksha. It is only the cessation of sorrow that occurs in moksha. For example, Sankhya calls it moksha as atyantika dukkha nivritti, the eternal cessation of sorrow. It does not explain it in positive terms like Vedanta does as Brahmananda. Coming to the next slide. Yeah. What is the nature of the objects that gives rise to these experiences? There is a difference in the nature of objects also. Aesthetic experience is possible only through objects that can be generalized to a degree. So why? Because only with such objects, such generalized objects, can the second thought not arise. Second thought such as let this experience continue or let this experience end, not arise. And these generalized objects are not causally affective in the sense they don't evoke any action from us. They don't evoke any goal specific action from us. So for example, one can experience anger at a specific enemy, real life enemy, and undertake some specific action such as attacking the enemy. But one cannot experience anger at a generalized category of enemy that is communicated through literature. And much less can we act in response to a generalized category of enemy. So coming to the next slide. Abhinav Gupta makes a very pertinent comment about the use of instrumental and vocal music as well as painting, sculpture, and dance with respect to the play, with respect to drama. And he says that these paraphernalia can actually transform even a non-connoisseur, that is an ahridaya, who is under the grip of his or her personal pleasure and sorrow, into a sahridaya, into a connoisseur. Hence, they are taken resort to before a play begins, so that the audience can slowly be transported to the aesthetic world. Why are these taken recourse to? Because they are not as rich in meaning as the drama. The script of the drama is richer in meaning than the instrumental or the vocal music. But at the same time, instrumental and vocal music being appealing to the audience at large, and why are they appealing? Because they are dependent on the auditory and visual senses, and these senses are very suited to evoke a shared experience of joy when compared to other senses. So you cannot share joy with respect to, say, for example, the sense of touch or the sense of taste. On the other hand, the auditory and visual senses are very amenable to a shared experience of joy, and these can easily therefore be the non-connoisseur of being under the grip of his own pleasure and displeasure. And therefore these auditory and visual paraphernalia like instrumental music, painting, etc. are taken into. It is not that the audience is given something to taste or something to touch. On the other hand, the audience is given something to hear and something to see, because it is possible to have a shared experience of joy only through these sense modalities. So coming to the next slide. What is the nature of objects that give rise to these experiences? So mundane experiences, these stem from specific objects that can evoke specific goal-oriented actions. Spiritual experiences, in fact, transcend the boundary of subject and object, because there is, at least in the Indian tradition, there is only the consciousness in the spiritual experience. So there is no question of a subject or an object. So to summarize, there is a plurality of subjects and objects in the mundane experience. In aesthetic experience, on the other hand, there is a generalization of objects and there is a sharing of parts of the subject in the aesthetic experience. So whereas in mundane experience, you have multiple subjects and multiple objects, in the aesthetic experience, there is a sharing of parts of the subjects and there is a generalization of the objects that are experienced. And in the spiritual experience, there is as we have seen, a collapse of both subjecthood as well as object. There is neither subject nor object in the spiritual experience. To come to the next slide. So Abhinav Gupta calls this aesthetic space as a twilight zone. So tatha videhi bhaye natma atyantam tiraskrito na visheshatah ullikitah evam paropi. In the aesthetic experience, the subject is neither completely obscured, as would occur in the case of a spiritual experience, nor is the subject made very conspicuous, as would occur in the mundane experience. And the same is true with respect to the object also. So neither is the object completely obscured nor made very conspicuous in the aesthetic experience. Coming to the next slide. Now let us go to Bhoja. Bhoja takes up a different question. He looks at the importance of hero for an aesthetic experience. And according to him, Rasa, the experience, Rasananda, the joyful experience, while when we are reading a work, when we are reading a literary work or when we are watching a play, it results from the identification of the spectator or the reader with the hero, the Nayaka. So coming to the next slide. So we know that the hero plays a very pivotal role in the literary work. And what makes the hero special? According to Bhoja, the hero has an assortment of positive traits. Obviously, the hero should have positive traits. And these traits are not only numerous, but they are also very strong. And that is why the hero has become the hero in the first place. And why does the hero need these traits? Why does the hero require these traits? He requires these traits in order to facilitate certain actions. And what are these actions that the hero will be performing using these traits? These are the actions that aid in the accomplishment of certain goals. So the hero has certain goals and he performs certain actions that are directed at those goals. And these actions are facilitated by certain traits, and these traits are present strongly as well as in larger many of these traits are present as well as they are present very strongly in the case of a hero, and that is why the hero is so special. So which are these goals? So there are these fourfold goals of artha, kama, dharma, and moksha, and for each of these you have a corresponding hero, which Bhoja designates as Uddhata, Lalita, Udatta, and Shanta. The Uddhata pursues the goal of artha, the Lalita pursues the goal of kama, the Udatta pursues dharma, and the Shanta pursues moksha. And all of these heroes have a highly evolved sense of I because of the presence of so many qualities, as well as because these presence of so many traits, and because these traits are present are very strong. Therefore, because of these traits, they have a very high sense of self, evolved sense of self, which is called as ahankara. And the reader, when he is watching a play or when he is reading a literary work, he identifies with the character's I. The reader's I and the reader's ahankara and the hero's ahankara align with one another. And this alignment, according to Bhoja, is responsible for rasa. And what are the traits that Bhoja discusses? I will not go into the details, but Bhoja gives a long list of traits, and he also provides examples from literature for each of these traits. So he divides the traits into three groups: the shared traits, the unique traits, and the differentiating traits. The shared traits are total of 24 traits. The unique traits are 8 for each of the characters, each of the 4 characters, and the differentiating traits are also 16 for each of these characters. And the shared traits are what are very important. All these shared traits are positive traits. And the character who pursues dharma as well as moksha have all the 24 positive traits. Whereas the character who pursues kama and the character who pursues artha don't have all the 24 traits, but only partly. So therefore, these are called as shared traits. So the character the nayaka who pursues kama pradhana nayaka has only 18 to 24 of these traits, while an artha pradhana nayaka has 12 to 18 of these traits. And why do they have lesser traits? Because the goals that they are pursuing are easier to achieve. So these traits can be considered as paraphernalia in the journey of the hero towards achieving these goals. And if the journey is far, then you need more paraphernalia. If you have to travel only 50 kilometers, you require lesser paraphernalia than you would require for a journey which is 500 kilometers. So the artha and the kama are like taking a journey of 50 kilometers or 100 kilometers, and therefore they have lesser traits. They have lesser of these positive traits because those many traits are enough to achieve their particular goals. Coming to the next slide. Bhoja's theory is very well worked out, and in this theory, you have several things aligning together: character's personality type, personality related life goals, goal congruent objects, object directed action, and action relevant traits, as well as well-being. There are certain aspects of this theory which may be relegated to the level of theology. So for example, you have past action, which gives rise to unseen merit. Past action, that is karma, giving rise to punya or papa. Even keeping these aside, the theory still makes sense. So unseen merit or punya results in the birth of an empirical self, and this empirical self in Bhoja's model has a personality type, and this personality type is made of certain traits, and along with the personality type also comes a life goal. So as soon as you are born, as an ayaka, you have a particular personality type which has an assortment of traits as well as life goal. It's a package, so life goal also comes along with it. So for that, why are the traits present? The traits are present in order to perform certain actions. And why are the actions required? Because there is a life goal, there are also goal congruent objects which have to be pursued, and the actions are there in order to pursue those goal congruent objects. Again, the actions can be successful or unsuccessful. So if they are successful in certain characters, it gives rise to well-being, but in all characters it gives rise to well-being. But if the actions are unsuccessful, by which I mean, if the actions don't don't help the hero to actually accrue the object which he is pursuing, if the action is unsuccessful, it can give rise to ill-being in certain characters only. But in some other characters, it doesn't give rise to ill-being. Even if the character is not able to accrue the object which he has been pursuing, there is no ill-being, because these characters' self-identity is based on their actions, on the performance of certain action. So if the action is performed, but the fruit of the action is not accrued, then these characters don't suffer ill-being. On the other hand, other characters, if they are unsuccessful, they suffer ill-being. These are characters whose traits are based on their, whose self-identity is based on their traits. So all characters have traits. In some characters, the self-identity is based on traits. In some other characters, the self-identity is based on action. In those characters where the self-identity is based on traits, unsuccessful action gives rise to ill-being. In those characters where the self-identity is based on action, unsuccessful activity also doesn't give rise to ill-being. So that is the point I wanted to make. So next slide. So this is just a list of these shared traits, and shared 24 traits. These actually, in a way, conform to personality strengths that are discussed in psychology. I won't go into those details, but then there are 24 personality strengths that have also been listed in psychology, and a comparison is possible between these 24 traits of Bhoja, shared traits of Bhoja, with those personality strengths. And as shown in the slide, you see that all the 24 traits are present in the Shanta and the Udatta characters who pursue dharma and moksha. Only 18 to 24 is present in the Lalita character, and 12 to 18 can be present in the Uddaka character. Coming to the next slide. Now, let us go to the last aspect of our talk, to Rupa Goswami. So Rupa Goswami belongs to the Gaudiya Vaishnava Parampara of Bengal and the surrounding regions. And he, in fact, tries to bridge the mundane, the aesthetic and spiritual experiences to the notion of bhakti. So is it possible actually to bridge the mundane, the aesthetic and the spiritual experiences, is the question which Rupa Goswami was asking. And the question I think he asked was, the Indian aestheticians discuss about Rasananda. And Rupa Goswami asked the question whether it is possible to have Rasananda outside the confines of the playhouse or outside the confines of a literary work. Even if there is no literary work, even if there is no play that is being watched, even after you have come out of the playhouse, even after you have closed the book which you have been reading, is it possible still to experience the Rasananda, which the Sahridayas experience? That is the question which he was trying to answer, and he came up with his own solution. So, in fact, even in our tradition since the Vedic times, the world has been compared to a play or a poem. The Vedas say, "Pashya devasya kavyam na mamara na jiryati." Look at the poetry of the Lord; it never ages or it never dies. So the entire creation is considered as a poem of the Lord, a poem that never ages, a poem that never dies. And Bhattanayaka, whom we were discussing in one of his works, Hridaya Darpana, the mirror to the heart, which unfortunately is not available, he starts with a praise to Shiva, where Shiva is considered as the script writer of the play that is the world. Namas Trailokya Nirmana Kavaye Shambhave Yataha Pratikshanam Jagannatya Prayoga Rasiko Janaha. So my salutations to Shiva, who is the Kavi, who is the poet, who has written the script for the play of the world. And it is because of him that everybody has become a Sahridaya. Everybody is experiencing this joy. So coming to the next slide. And it seems the Gaudiya Vaishnava poeticians, such as Rupa Goswami, took this metaphor very literally. And so they wanted to ask, can the mundane life itself be viewed as an ongoing drama? We discussed under Bhoja that a pivotal character is the hero in a drama. And it is on the hero that the rasa experience hinges. Everything facilitates the hero's actions, and finally it is through the hero that the rasa emerges. whatever the rasa may be. And if rasa must occur, if the rasa experience has to occur in everyday life, then we require a hero in everyday life too. And everyday life hero, and if this rasa experience should be there 24/7 for everybody in this world, then we require a hero who transcends time and space. And in that tradition of the Gaudiya Vaishnavas, the hero that they could figure out is Krishna. So if everyday life can be conceptualized as an ongoing divine drama, then every object in that divine drama, every mundane object should also become an object of the drama. And since the hero of this drama transcends space and time, the objects in this drama must also transcend space and time. And since every one of us is a part of life, we cannot look at this drama as a passive spectator, because we are also part of life. If life itself is a drama, we cannot disengage from it and look at it like a spectator watches a drama, but we have to actively engage with this drama. We cannot become a passive spectator, but we have to actively don a role in the drama. And in doing so, that is, in actively donning a role, what happens is oneself transcends the barrier of time and space, and for example becomes a gopi in relation to Krishna. Coming to the next slide. Coming to the next slide. Can we go to the next slide, please? Yeah, thank you.
Yes, sir. I
So,
accepted.
yeah, thank you. So what is this? This is actually the transformation of everyday individual, the mundane individual, into a bhakta. Who is a bhakta? So the bhakta is a sahridaya who not merely watches a play, as the sahridaya of Abhinav Gupta or sahridaya of Nayaka would do. He or she doesn't merely watch a play, but actually participates in the play. And he is the true aesthete. For him or her, everyday objects appear aesthetic, and everyday objects lose their limited personal meanings, since he or she has himself transformed into someone else. And whom has he or she transformed into a character that transcends, a character such as a gopi who transcends the boundary of time and place. So actually an episode from Bhagavatam explicates this. You have an episode in Bhagavatam where Brahma actually steals away the cows as well as the cowherds from Gokula for a period of an year. And during this entire year, Krishna himself transforms into those cows, those calves, and those different gopas, those different cowherd boys. And everybody is actually in this transformed space. Actually, everybody is directly related to Krishna. And Vyasa in Bhagavatam describes that this period was filled with joy, when everybody actually connected with their own, every father and mother connected with his or her child, and everybody connected with the cows and the calves as if they were connecting with Krishna himself. And this, it seems, the people of Gokula at that time were simultaneously experiencing the mundane happiness, and that mundane happiness had transformed to spiritual happiness, and that spiritual happiness itself is the aesthetic happiness, aesthetic joy of rasa. So coming to the next slide, which is the concluding slide. So we have actually come a complete circle now. So starting from Bharata, who envisaged that the aesthetic space of drama as providing an experience that is distinct from everyday experience. So for Bharata, the drama is a space that provides a different sort of experience than the mundane experience. From him, we have gone to Nayaka and Abhinav Gupta, who describe this experience as bordering on the spiritual. It borders on the spiritual, but it is still wedged between the spiritual and the mundane. And therefore, it is still different from the mundane as well as spiritual. Then we come to Bhoja, who argues for the importance of the hero in evoking this experience, rasa experience. So the experiences occurs because of identification with the hero. And in Rupa Goswami, we go a step further. So we come a full circle where to which the mundane world, in which the bhakta we come to a full circle in which the mundane world you have the mundane world in which the bhakta can have an experience that is simultaneously mundane, just as the people of Gokula had. It is simultaneously mundane because they are actually interacting with their own children, with their own calves and cows. But at the same time, it is spiritual because all of them are manifestations of Krishna. And as Rupa Goswami ordered, this spiritual experience is nothing but the experience of rasa that is plucked out from the confines of the playhouse or the confines of a literary text and transported into the mundane world. So here, the mundane, the aesthetic, and spiritual have become one. And this happens because of the active participation of the bhakta in an ongoing drama, and an ongoing drama where the hero, and this hero is not just the hero of Oja, who is a very mundane hero. This is a hero par excellence, the heroes of heroes, who is Krishna. So with this slide, I come to an end of my talk, and thanks a lot to everybody for having provided me an opportunity to share the little knowledge that I have on Indian aesthetics. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Shankar, for that absolutely mesmerizing talk. I think, my mind is racing with questions, and I assume that there are a lot of people who are also feeling similarly. So if you do have any questions, please do raise your hands using the raise hand function, as we've been doing for the past couple of sessions. There are a couple of questions on the chat box as well, so you could input them there. So yeah, I see Kanchan's hand up. Could we please unmute her and please go ahead.
Yeah, I'm trying to unmute you. Can you please unmute yourself?
Now I could unmute. Yeah. Thank you for this wonderful talk. Throughout your talk, we could feel that somewhere in Indian aesthetics, the concept of dharma or a spiritual experience has been an integral part of it. So it is very difficult to take out even bhakti is a kind of rasa as well, and it is a kind of, we say, bhakti marga as well. So is there any kind of, because we can see now in modern studies, we can have this distinction as a psychology and maybe this is a dharma shastra, but earlier maybe the entire life was aimed at moksha only in those days when these theories. So can we see that there is a kind of hierarchy in experiences where they are saying that whenever you are watching a piece of drama or literature, then the kind of rasas that you experience and the experience, your spiritual experience is spiritual experience treated higher than the mundane experience. Somewhere we can find in aesthetics. How does aesthetic look at it?
Yeah, see, it depends on the aesthetician whom you are considering. So certain there is a big legion of aestheticians who don't consider bhakti as a rasa at all. So they would consider bhakti just as a type of Shringara, a type of love. And on the other hand, you have other group of aestheticians who argue strongly saying that bhakti is the only rasa. Like you have the Rupa Goswami and other people from Gaudiya Vaishnava Parampara. They say that bhakti is such an encompassing rasa that all other rasas can come under the purview of bhakti. The only difference between bhakti and Shringara in a sense would be that the hero here is much more embellished hero than a mundane hero of Shringara. So for example, you have a hero such as say Udayana or others who are there only as long as we are watching the performance. So after the performance, there is this Udayana, a character such as Udayana belongs to the fancy world. He does not exist at all. But on the other hand, you cannot say the same thing with respect to Krishna. You cannot say that Krishna is something who is a hero who belongs to the world of fancy, because for many people he is a living presence. So because of this, there is a clear-cut distinction between a hero such as Krishna and all other mundane heroes. On the other, as I told you, many people don't consider bhakti as a rasa, but personally, I feel I tend to go with Rupa Goswami and consider bhakti also as a.
Thank you, sir. Are there any other questions? I see that there are a couple of questions in the chat box. Maybe I'll just read them out and you could take whichever ones you'd like, sir. One is, how do modern Indian plays and narratives or movies match up to this ancient scale? How do they differ from Campbell's idea of a hero's journey? There is another question from Upendra who asks, what is the state of the performer? Does he experience rasa? Sundar asks, can we say that aesthetic experience sacrifices intensity for a more refined, rarefied, subtler experience? And Narasimha Murthy asks, during the discussion, you mentioned that the world, no, that is, I think Rupa Goswamin, no, there was an author who mentioned that the world is an unending poem, whereas many philosophies say that this world is transitory. How do we understand this poem context in regard to the world?
The last question, I couldn't hear properly.
So the question is, there was a poem that you read where Shiva is the author of the poem.
Correct.
So the question is, if the world is an unending poem, how do we understand this concept in today's world?
Okay. So maybe I'll take up two of these questions. So one of these questions, the second question was about whether the performer himself herself experiences rasa. So again, this is something which is contested. There are aestheticians who argue that the performer himself or herself experiences rasa, and there are others who say the performer is usually called as a patra. So the patra, the character, is called as the patra, or patradhari. The performer is called as the patradhari. So the patra is basically like the literal meaning of the word patra is a utensil or a vessel. So the patra is like a vessel for rasa. Just like a patra, the vessel cannot taste what is put into it. So whatever you put, water or sambar or something else, the vessel cannot taste it. In the same way, the patra cannot taste rasa. And I feel to an extent this might be correct, because the patra is concerned only about his own character, what he has to, the character that he has to portray on the stage. He does not have the full knowledge of the, he's not like the spectator who looks at the play in its entirety. He looks at the play only with respect to the role that he has donned, and therefore, because that is partial, he cannot have the experience of rasa. On the other hand, I feel the poet who has actually penned a drama might actually experience rasa, and that is a difference between the poet as well as the actor. The poet actually experiences rasa, on the other, whereas the actor doesn't experience rasa. Though there are also aestheticians who would argue that the actor also experiences rasa. So that is the second question. The first question, can you please repeat?
Just a minute, sir. I'm just going back. How do modern Indian plays, narratives, movies match up to this ancient scale? That is, I think, one part of the question. The second part is how they differ from Campbell's idea of a hero's journey.
Okay. The second part of the question, I am afraid I cannot answer, because I am not aware of this particular theory by Campbell. Campbell, I think. No? And I think I should be educated more on this so I can comment on it. The first, I think it is possible to analyze our movies based on these aesthetic principles. Especially, I find Bhoja very useful. Bhoja's model very useful to analyze our movies, and especially the characters. And as a part of my, as an implication of my thesis, actually, I spoke about how Bhoja's model could be extended beyond the realms of Sanskrit aesthetics and Sanskrit literature, possibly to analyze characters in world literature and characters even in movies. So that is a possibility, and I find it a very workable possibility. In fact, one of these sessions, one of the earlier sessions, we had used this model of Bhoja in order to understand certain characters from Macbeth also. So I think it is possible to.
Thank you, sir. I see Sanjana's hand up. Could we please unmute her?
Hello, sir. Thank you for your lecture. So my question had to do with Boja's theory of identification. So I had my question focuses on background characteristics of the reader's identity. So how does like one's background identities in terms of, let's say, class or gender, that determine someone's place in the social world and that affect their mundane experiences, how do these affect the process of identification with the hero who might have a very different set of identities? So if I'm, let's say, like a poor woman, how does my these
Hello.
I think
Yeah.
she was. Hi, Sanjana, you got stuck in between. Could you repeat that last part of the question?
Yeah. So, sir, if like, let's say I'm a poor woman watching a play about Rama, how does my characteristics as a poor woman affect the process of identification with the hero who is, a man from like a royal family? So how do these background characteristics mediate the process of identification, or does it have no effect at all according to his theory?
Yeah. So whether the background affects the experience of rasa, that is what you're
Yeah.
So obviously it affects, and therefore there is this particular group of sahridayas that has been proposed by the Sanskrit traditions. Not everybody can be a sahridaya for everything. So one of the characteristics of a sahridaya is that he leaves behind this personal baggage when he is experiencing, when he is enjoying a play or when he is reading a particular text. So that is one of the requirements, in fact, to become a sahridaya. Unless you give up your baggage of you give up your personal baggage, it would be very difficult to actually identify with the hero. And that is why Abhinav Gupta lists several things that has to be done before a play actually starts, so that a person who is so much occupied with his personal baggage that he is not able to get into the skin of the character, or he is not able to enjoy the play. There are certain things that Abhinav Gupta mentions which has to be carried out as a preliminary before a play begins, so that the audience gradually gives up this personal baggage and is able to enter into another. So that is something which that is a requirement actually, according to Indian ethics, that you leave behind your personal baggage.
Thank
that might
you.
be a little controversial, and it might indicate that not all, but all can become sahridayas, but everybody can become a sahridaya of some or the other literary piece or some or the other thing. So that doesn't take away a person's ability to enjoy one or the other play. He might enjoy this, or he might not. He might enjoy something else, but he still remains a sahridaya for something else. So,
Thank you, sir. There are two more questions in the chat box. And if anyone else has other questions, please do raise your hands. The first question is by Pooja Kamat. She says, could you please suggest a text where the 48 mental states by Bharata can be explored further? And the second part of her question, does the text share the details about the two questions? What causes the mental state and how it is expressed? To understand the stimuli response of mental states.
so obviously, this is the what I talked today was all based on text itself, text only, and therefore Bharata, the first book that lists all these 49 mental states is Bharata's book. A translation of Bharata's Natya Shastra are available aplenty actually. Even if you make an archive search, you will get several translations of Bharata's Natya Shastra. And in the chapters 6 and 7, the Rasadhyaya and the Bhavadhyaya, he gives details of these 49 mental states. So, of which 8 are Sai Bhavas and 41 are the Vyabhichari Bhavas. Actually, there are 3 classifications: the Sai Bhavas, the Vyabhichari Bhavas, and the Satvika Bhavas. But the Satvika Bhavas also have the characteristic of Vyabhichari Bhava, and therefore I included them under the Vyabhichari Bhava. These details are present in all the, not just Bharata, but the aestheticians who followed later also added to the list. So Bharata gives a list of stimuli responses for all these 49 mental states. So as I gave an example of Garva, right? He gives a list of say 10 stimuli for Garva and 10 responses that arise from Garva. But later aestheticians have often added to the list also. So you have a bigger list of stimuli and bigger list of responses when you actually collate all the later aestheticians. So which I did in my thesis. I worked on 3 different self-conscious emotions: Garva, Asuya, and Preda. And I could expand the list because I looked up looked up a text written by later aestheticians and found that there are several stimuli and responses which are not listed by Bharata. And so obviously this list is easily available. Only that many of these texts are not translated into translated from Sanskrit into English, and so a little bit of understanding of preliminary Sanskrit might help those who are interested.
Thank you, sir. There's one last question I see. How should we think about the term exalted in describing shared traits? Does it change according to context? For example, exalted birth can mean born in a wealthy family, but exalted could also refer to someone born in a poor family, but who's also loving and nurturing. So how do we understand this term?
Yeah. So since Shringara Prakasha is the text which I chose mainly for my thesis, and it is a very voluminous text of, it's the most voluminous text of Indian aesthetics by Bhoja, and unfortunately it has not been translated into any language, even into Hindi. And portions of Bhoja's Shringara Prakasha was what I took. There are 4 chapters, one chapter on the Nayaka who pursues dharma, one on moksha, one on artha, and one on kama. And what Bhoja does is, not only does he list these traits, I have just translated it as exalted because I felt that it somehow the translation somehow communicated what Bhoja was trying to say. But how do we actually know what these traits stand for? And that is where there is the ingenuity of Bhoja. He not just lists these traits, but he also provides examples for each of these traits from Sanskrit literature. So when he is saying exalted birth, then what exactly does he mean by exalted birth? We can understand what he means because of the examples that he gives from various texts. So here it actually means being born in a very well-known family, say for example, like Rama or Ravana also. So that is what he means by exalted birth, and we know that that is what he means because of the examples that he gives. So when he's telling about exalted birth, he's giving a verse from Ramayana, not from Ramayana, from one of the Sanskrit works based on Ramayana, or some other play. He's giving an example, and studying those examples, we know what actually he means when he says exalted birth. So that is how I could figure out what he actually means. And he not just provides one example, he actually provides for each of these characters. It's actually a very it's very mind-boggling actually to look at the examples, the number of examples that Bhoja has chosen. What he does is, you know that Bharata has given this list of 49 mental states. What Bhoja does is, he says that these 49 mental states are not expressed similarly in all the 4 characters. So a character who pursues dharma might experience garva in a different way than a character who pursues artha, than a character who pursues kama. So for each of these characters, he gives 2 examples for each of the 49 mental states. So that is the number of examples that he gives. And because of all these examples, and the examples are not given just for the mental state, but also for the traits. And the traits are not just the shared traits. You have another list of unique traits, another list of generalized differentiating traits also. So for all these traits, he provides several examples. For each of the character, he provides two examples. So you have hundreds of examples that are provided, and studying these examples, we know what actually Bhoja means when he is talking about a particular trait.
Thank you, sir. There's one more question from Kanchal. She says, could you explain the implications of the word kavya in Indian aesthetics, because it seems to refer to much more than poetry?
Yeah. So kavya is a word which has been the word which is most contested and which is poorly understood in Kavya Shastra is the word kavya. So several aestheticians have given different definitions of the word kavya. The simplest definition is kavehe karma kavyam, the activity of a poet. The word kavya comes from the word kavi. So the activity of a poet is kavya, but that's a very simplistic definition, because then it will lead us to the second question, who is a kavi, which is a much more difficult question, I think, to answer. So you have different definitions of kavya given. So each aesthetician is at loggerheads with the other aesthetician regarding the definition of the word kavya. But then kavya actually, as you said, refers to much more than just poetry. So by poetry here we would mean versified poetry, and versified poetry is called as padya. So, but again, not everything that is padya is poetry. For example, you cannot, by any stretch of imagination, call Kushruta or Charaka as writing poetry. They obviously write padya. They obviously write versified verses, but these verses cannot be called as poems. At the other end, you have people who are writing completely in prose and who are also called as kavi, and their works are also called as kavya. For example, Banabhatta's Harsha Charita and Kadambari are complete prose romances and prose biographies, but both are called as kavya. So it is not just the form that determines what is kavya; it is the content that determines it. And the content is something which has to actually evoke what Jagannatha calls as chamatkara in the mind of the spectator. So again, what is chamatkara? Finally, it boils down to what evokes rasa would actually be what would actually be called as kavya. So, but again, that would also be stifling actually the definition of kavya, because sometimes kavya may not actually evoke rasa, but it might be some sort of an intellectual gymnastics that has been understood as kavya. But even that is included under the umbrella of kavya. So this is a very contested territory, but the presence of rasa, there should be some chamatkara, and form is not that important as the ability to evoke chamatkara in the mind of the Saka. That is what is kavya.
Thank you, sir, for that very fascinating answer. I see Upendra's hand up. If he's unmuted.
Sir, this is a very important lecture for me, being an actor and a director for the past many long years. But when I work with the actors, how will I explain rasa and the bhava process for an actor to come on stage on screen without referring to Veda, Krishna, Shiva, Vasana, and other things? Because there are people who are good actors, are potential to become a good actors, who do not know or who do not believe this. If this is so, what might be the bridge for me to reach them? Because they are good, they are very much in need of for the profession, for the product and other things, sir.
Yeah, thank you, sir, for this. This is a very practical question that you are asking. But see, I will also give a practical answer. All reading of, and this is through my own experience. I also write poetry, and I enjoy writing poetry much more than reading these works on Sanskrit aesthetics, because actually my happiness comes from writing poetry rather than reading about the process of poetry or the process of enjoyment. So I think poetry is something to be enjoyed and experienced rather than to be explained. So, and I know several people who traditionally study, say, Abhinavagupta, Bhattanayaka, or Bhoja, etc., but they cannot enjoy one good piece of poetry. And ability to enjoy poetry or ability to enjoy a drama that is being portrayed in front of you I don't think has anything to do with understanding the concept of Sanskrit aesthetics. It is a completely different different set of skills. The ability to enjoy doesn't come just because you have read all these texts on Sanskrit aesthetics. It comes, I think, it is. Therefore, when you say Sahridaya in Sanskrit, Sahridaya is not a person who has read Bhoja or who has read say read Abhinavgupta and Nayaka. Sahridaya is a person who can actually experience this Rasananda when he or she is watching. And therefore, anybody who enjoys poetry or anybody who actually enjoys watching a performance, even a movie, is a Sahridaya for that matter, even without understanding the subtleties of rasa, etc. underlying. So I don't know how you would actually, if you get into Shastra, you would have to confront these various terminologies and you would have to explain them using these terminologies. But if you are confining to the level of experience, you don't require these terminologies at all. Experience is different, education is different.
I think Kopendra has a follow-up question. Maybe just one last question, sir. I see a couple of other questions in the chat box. I think we're also running out of time.
Sir, in the context of actors training process, I was questioning, sir. Whatever you have said is exactly to the point. It's a reference for me. But in the context of actor training, we always used to struggle to communicate to those people who are not aware of these things, who do not believe in it, sir. So in that context, only I asked.
Yeah, sure, sir. So you can explain the principles of Rasa Shastra, this is Alankara Shastra, this is Rasa, etc., without actually alluding to anything very spiritual, or without alluding. See, the spiritual experience is beyond our grip. None of us has had an experience of a yogi. On the other hand, none of us can deny the experience of joy that we acquire when we are reading a good piece of work or when we are seeing a good piece of drama being enacted in front of us. So I think without alluding to all, I brought in Rupa Goswami and Krishna only because it is a continuation of Bhoja's theory. So you need not actually think of Krishna as Krishna. You can think of Krishna as a hero who is, if you can conceive of the greatest hero possible, a hero par excellence, you can consider that hero as Krishna. You need not actually believe in Krishna, but you can still believe in an ideal hero, a hero who transcends all other heroes. At least to the level of imagination or belief, you can still believe a hero. And if you believe a hero, everything else that follows from believing Krishna as a hero will follow. So you need not actually believe Krishna. You can believe a great hero. So that can happen. So you need not always see Abhinavgupta, because he's from the Pratyabhijna Darshana background, he brings in aspects from Kashmir Shaivism, and therefore he calls Shiva, Samvit, etc. But without using Shiva and Samvit, we all know, but we all, when we tell our friends, oh, this movie was very good, or this particular literary piece was very good, we are not saying that I experienced Shiva when we don't say like that, but we still say that we are experiencing joy. Shiva is just a synonym for joy in that particular philosophical background. So you can still say that I experienced joy, and from a philosophical point of view, Pratyabhijna Darshana, Abhinavgupta would take it as the experience of Shiva. That's all.
So thank you for that. I think really brilliant answer. I see that someone has actually echoed that. I really enjoyed that. Maybe we can just take the last two questions. One from Nagashri. She says, are any of the traits described by Bhoja helpful in psychology therapies?
Yeah, so this is again something which I gave as an implication of my thesis. So you can actually, I don't know if it's possible to build a questionnaire based on these traits and then evaluate personalities. And see, what Bhoja does is, I did not discuss Bhoja in detail. Bhoja not just describes these traits, he also links these traits to mental states, experience of pleasure and displeasure on one hand, and he also links these traits to certain life goals. In other words, he's telling that pursuit of certain life goals is actually giving rise to pleasure, and pursuit of some other life goals is actually giving rise to displeasure. Everyday people, the people whom we meet in therapy, for example, are not like the primary characters whom Bhoja describes. Bhoja describes prototypical characters, a character who is predominantly pursuing only artha, another character who is predominantly pursuing only dharma. But such characters are not seen in day-to-day life. We are a mixture of all these. At some time we pursue artha, shunning away all other goals. Some other time we are pursuing dharma, some other time we are pursuing kama. Rarely do we pursue moksha. So we are a mixture of various characters. So we are like secondary characters. So in Sanskrit aesthetics, you have what are called as primary characters and the secondary characters. Primary characters are prototypical characters, but these primary characters are very important because it is through the primary characters that you are educated. The audience, without knowing that he or she is being educated, gets educated about these fourfold goals of life: dharma, artha, kama, and moksha. If you show the primary character also has wavering in his or her goal, say for example, Rama in the first scene is shown as pursuing dharma. In the second scene, suddenly he starts pursuing kama. In the third scene, he starts pursuing artha. In the fourth scene, he starts pursuing moksha. Then this educative component of drama will not be fulfilled. The audience will not get to know, will not get a full-fledged knowledge about how to pursue one particular goal. Therefore, the primary characters need to be shown only as pursuing a particular goal. But there is all sort of liberty with respect to secondary characters. Secondary characters usually, for example, Parashurama. You see that Parashurama is at one time he's pursuing dharma and at other time he's shown like a prototype of an artha dominant person. So we are like secondary characters. And when Parashurama is shown as pursuing artha, you see that there is a conglomeration of all negative mental states. There is a predominance of displeasurable mental states. And when he has suddenly modified into a dharmic individual, you see that there is a conglomeration of all the positive mental states, all pleasurable mental states. So this happens to us also. So in a therapy session, it's very difficult to get an answer when you ask a patient, what is your life goal? This is a very difficult question to answer. On the other hand, you can to some extent introspect and say whether you are happy or sad. That is a little more easier question to answer. So if we introspect, we find that when we are happy, when we had been sad a few days back, possibly we were like artha dominant individuals. And what are the characteristics of artha dominant individuals? Something which is a greater part of my thesis and which I cannot elaborate here. But then artha goes with the experience of competitiveness, the experience of a lot of interpersonal problems, the experience of displeasurable mental states, all these. So when on days when we are displeasurable, possibly we were in the artha mode. On other days when we were at peace with ourselves, possibly we did not think about competing with others, or we did not think of others as competing with us. There were no such interpersonal problems, interpersonal problems on those days, and therefore on those days we were relatively pleasurable. So this sort of maybe this sort of knowledge from Bhoja's theory can be used in psychotherapy also.
Thank you, sir. Maybe the last question for today. When we speak of aesthetics, are we largely referring to only poetry and other literary works, or do we also refer to other aesthetic works like painting and architecture?
Yeah, so this is at the same time easy and difficult to answer, because easy because Sanskrit aesthetics has Sanskrit. I don't know whether aesthetics is a very good translation to Alankara Shastra also, because Alankara Shastra limits itself to only poetry and literature, or only to literature, and does not go beyond literature into other art forms like painting, etc. But Abhinavgupta's comments are in the background of dramaturgy, because Abhinavgupta is actually commenting on Bharata's work, which is on dramaturgy. And dramaturgy is a wholesome art. So it brings within its script all other art forms also. There is music, there is dance, there is literature also, there is instrumental music, all sorts of other art forms. There is painting, there is sculpture, etc., which come into within the confines of dramaturgy. And therefore, Abhinavgupta makes pertinent comments on these other art forms also. But later aestheticians, they only talk about poetry and literature when they are talking about Kavya Shastra. But there are people like, say, for example, Bhoja. Bhoja is a polymath, and so he has also written something called as the Samarangana Sutradhara, which is a work on architecture. And in Samarangana Sutradhara, just as we have the rasa of poetry, he speaks about the rasa of sculpture also. So there have been attempts actually to use this idea of rasa in other art forms also, though they have not been studied as deeply. Maybe there have been attempts to understand other art forms from the background of rasa theory, but these have been mostly by recent people, and traditionally these have been mostly through interpretation rather than traditionally they being given on a platter.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much for that really fascinating lecture. And I think there's been a lot of engagement and a lot of wonderful discussion. There are a couple of messages requesting your email. I think some people would like to get in touch with you independently as well. So as you all know, the WhatsApp group will be open following this. Dr. Shankar Rajaraman, as one of the conceptualizers of this course, is also a part of that group. So please do feel free to type in your messages, your questions, or just initiate a discussion. And I'm sure that he will also respond as and when he has the time. So I think that brings us to the end of the 9th lecture for this series. It is an enormous honor, sir, for me to thank you. And thank you so much for agreeing to give this course. Thank you for taking time away from what I know has been a very busy day for you to deliver this lecture. On behalf of the entire NIA CSP team, thank you. I'd also like to thank the head and dean of the Consciousness Studies program, Professor Sangeeta Menon, for being the backbone behind this and also for conceiving of and facilitating this course. I'd like to thank my colleagues, Niharika, Ashwini, Abhishek, Meera, for all the support and for making this seamlessly possible. And I'd also like to thank NIAS for the platform.
I would
And
also like to express my thanks to Sangeeta ma'am, to Dr. Pushya, to Ashwini, and Niharika, others who have helped me delivering this lecture through their help.
Thanks a lot, sir. And we look forward to seeing you all next week for another very interesting lecture. Good evening and see you all next week.